In the last lecture, you learned how to make the post selectable, but that of course has nothing to do with Axios or with HTTP requests. It was vanilla React, a nice practice, but now let's move on and let's actually send a HTTP request once we got a valid ID. Now, which lifecycle hook should we use here? Let's have a look. If we have a look at the lifecycle hook for updating components, and we are of course speaking about the update lifecycle hook, because the component is there right from the start, but data should be fetched once we receive a new prop ID. So that is what we're looking for. Then component.update is a good place for causing side effects. It also has one issue though. If we update the state in there, we update the component again and we therefore enter an infinite loop. That is something we'll have to watch out for. But first of all, let's make the HTTP request. I'll head over to full post, and first of all we need to import Axios here. Axios from the Axios package. Then in full post, in the component, we can implement component.update and make the HTTP request. So there I can use Axios get, and now the URL has to target one single post by the ID. If we have a look at our dummy backend, there is a route for that, get, and then post/the ID. So we can copy that URL and now make a request to that URL, though of course we'll not hardcode 1 in there, but instead use plus this props ID to take the ID we got on the props. Of course, we also don't want to send this request if ID is null. So we don't want to do this if the ID is invalid. So I will check if this props ID is treated as true, which means it is a valid ID, and then we can actually send this request with Axios and the get method to that URL. Now if I do add the then block here, I can output that with console log response. And we should see a response as soon as we clicked on one element. So if I click on an element here, we see the response. Now this works fine here. However, of course we want to output it. So we should also manage some state in here. And maybe we have like a loaded post in this element, in this component, which is initially set to null. Then here we can output loaded post title and loaded post content in our post.jsx content. And in here, where I log the response, I won't log it anymore. Instead, what I want to do here is I want to call this set state and there set the loaded post to the response data, which will be the post that we fetched from the backend. And in our JSX code, of course, we should access loaded post on this state, like that. Now with that, if we go to our application and reload it, and I click on a post, we actually receive an error that we can't read title of null. This makes a lot of sense because here in our JSX code for full post, we immediately access this state loaded post title. And we do this as soon as we got a valid property. Now we get a valid property before we have a valid loaded post. Because as you learned, fetching data is asynchronous. So first we get the ID, and then a little bit later we get the loaded post. But we re-render the DOM immediately after we got the ID. We can simply fix this by adding a check for the validity of the ID with this props ID, as we already have it, and say that in this case, post should actually be a paragraph still, but maybe a paragraph where we simply say loading, because we selected a post, but the data isn't there yet. And then in the bottom if statement, we check if state loaded post has been set, because initially it's null, so it will be treated as false, but as soon as we got one, this will return to true or resolve to true, and hence we will render this JSX code. And now if I save this and I click on a post, we see loading for a fraction of a second, and then we see the post. We also got an issue here though. If we open the network tab, you see that we're sending after request after request after request. We can simply reload the page to make sure this stops. But why are we seeing this? We are seeing these infinite requests because we're updating the state from within component did update. And this creates an infinite loop because when we call set state, the component will be updated and component did update will execute again. So we have to make sure that we only send this HTTP request and hence update the state if we actually loaded a new post. So how do we do that? We can add an if check inside the outer if check here. And there we can show if we already have loaded post, if that is true. So that is a first indicator that we did already load a post. Then of course we also want to make sure that for this loaded post, the ID is not the same ID as we just got via props, because that would mean the ID for which we want to fetch new data is the ID we already have loaded. So we don't need to make a HTTP request in this case. So here we'll check if we have a loaded post, and then if this state loaded post ID is unequal to props ID. So if we essentially try to get data for a new post, which is fine, in which case I want to make the HTTP request. In all other cases, I won't go ahead and make it because then we're trying to fetch data for a request we already have, for a post we already have. This should be this props, of course. Now let's see if I load that page and I click on a post. Well, we never get the post data. So somehow our check here is failing. Well, we have to amend it a little bit because initially it will of course fail because loaded post is null initially. So this would only succeed if we had at least one post loaded. So I will instead check if we don't have this state loaded post, or if we do have it, but if it then also has a different ID than the ID we plan on loading. So we go ahead and make the request either if we have no loaded post or if we do have one, but the IDs are different. Whoops, this should be loaded post though. So now if we save this and we go back to the application, on the network tab, if I click a post, it loads and it doesn't start sending infinity requests. And I can still switch, but we only get one request per switch. And that is exactly what we want. So now we got a way of safely fetching data in component did update, and still component did update is the right place because we want to fetch data whenever we receive new props.